to calm down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we shall not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right. Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to calm down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we shall not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right.
So, thanks again to Jim for bringing me back to offer some more of my thoughts and perspectives on another lofty theme. Jim, I hope you don't mind. I'm not doing this to embarrass you by any means, but I am going to share the correspondence that led to me being here this morning with you all. It's because it's kind of interesting. So Jim sent me an email about 6 weeks ago that said, "Jeff, unfortunately you did so well in December sermon that there are requests to have you back," with an exclamation point. "So I'm going to impose on seeing if you'd be able to do another one of your stellar speeches on March 4th. Well, like Sally Fields in her memorable Oscar speech from '84, I thought, you like me. You really like me. I'd been validated. I held off on replying to Jim's email for just long enough so that Jim might think I took sufficient time to check my schedule, assess the time commitment, and measure the opportunity to give a sermon against the many, many critically more important things that I must otherwise need to be doing. Then and only then did I press send on the draft email that had been written instantly after I received Jim's email. My email back to Jim was quick and terse, and to show how in demand my time really is. And I said, "That works. What's the topic?" To which Jim replied, "Humility." I thought, oh my God, am I being pranked? Where are the hidden cameras? The irony was so clear. It was like the irony of when in the military we used to say, all leave is canceled till morale improves. It was like the irony when I was a Catholic kid growing up and you didn't want to disappoint the priest and you were supposed to go to confession every 2 weeks. So I would go into confession and it'd go something like this. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 2 weeks since my last confession." "What are your sins, son?" "I lie." So anyway, the irony is thick. Anyway, humility is really tricky. Unlike the other themes that we've unpacked this church year, humility is a virtue that ironically can only be revealed to you by others. You can call yourself loving, hopeful, faithful, hospitable, all day long and twice on Sundays. But how do we know if we're being humble if we can't ask others for feedback? Like I said, it's tricky. Most of us are taught from a very young age the need to succeed and work hard to get ahead. Some of us believe in the value for striving for perfection. We all know that the most popular spot in the Barnes & Noble bookstore is the self-help section. But when does this notion of self-worth and self-esteem reach a tipping point and become a more toxic form of arrogance and conceit? In her sermon titled Cultivating Humility, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray helps us understand the subtle differences. She writes, "Authentic humility is this middle place. It is not meek or passive. It is about being grounded in one's own humanity, aware of both one's ignorance and ordinariness, and yet unwilling neither to compromise one's dignity nor to fail to defend the worth and dignity of another. A mature, authentic humility means that the meek must remember their own worth and power, and the powerful must remember their ordinariness and their dependence." Spiritual writer Carolyn Myss tells us, "Without humility, you're not in balance. The smallest motion can rock your boat and upset you. A person doesn't greet you properly, you aren't the first in line, you're not seated in the first row, you're not waited on in the restaurant fast enough. Someone makes a critical remark and you're destroyed for weeks, months, maybe years, and maybe you even need therapy to cope. A relationship disintegrates because pride prevents reconciliation. A humble person would move through all of these incidents without leaving a wake. As observers in our world, the distinction between the humble and the hubris sometimes is obvious. We've all interacted with people that are pompous or braggadocious. We're familiar with certain public figures that carelessly throw around superlatives claiming how they're the smartest or the least racial or maybe how they have the best words. It's tempting to focus on the opposite of humility because it really seems easier to spot. Take, for example, however, that's not always the case. Take, for example, charity and philanthropy. On the surface, it may seem humble to give of your time, talents, and hard-earned money to help those in need. No doubt that the folks in this congregation and this fellowship and our outward displays of speaking on behalf of justice, feeding the poor, supporting those in need are real and legitimate. But don't be fooled by all acts of philanthropy. An emerging practice with American big business is to establish supposedly philanthropic foundations under the guise of public good. According to author and Stanford political scientist Rob Reich, corporate philanthropy more often than not, quote, represents the exercise of power in which they attempt to use their own private wealth to affect public outcomes or to produce public benefits or make social change. So in our attempt this morning to truly understand humility and how we can foster a more humble approach in our lives, I think we're better served to focus on what it is rather than what it isn't. I'm certain we've all encountered those who are truly humble in spite of the fact that by definition they're meant to fly under the radar and will never get the same amount of the press as those that are pompous. The humble spend their time walking the walk, not just talking the talk. I'm reminded of Nick Foles' post-Super Bowl press conference. As Inc. magazine columnist Justin Bariso noted, he could have told us that he knew all along he would make it here. He could have told us how he deserved to be on this stage, that he'd never lost belief in himself or doubted his abilities. He could have told us that, but he didn't, because he knew more than anyone else those things wouldn't be true. Instead, Foles reminded us that as recently as a couple of years ago, he almost gave up on football. As he shared his struggle, he was calm and collected, an image he projected throughout the previous few hours from his warm-ups to his outstanding performance. Foles then taught a major lesson in leadership brilliantly captured in just a few short words. Quote, this is Nick Foles, I'm quoting. I think the big thing that helped me was knowing that I didn't have to be Superman. I have amazing teammates, amazing coaches around me, and all I had to do was just go and play as hard as I could and play for one another and just play for those guys. The thing is, Foles did play like Superman. He managed to display poise and humility. In just a few short sentences, he captured much about what great leadership is all about. But can we know for sure that Nick Foles' press conference remarks weren't scripted? Do we know for sure that he wasn't feigning humility by saying those wonderful things about his teammates and coaches? Well, we don't, but we can certainly see a pattern, I believe, from Foles that suggests he is organically humble. I believe that he walks the walk. I'll argue, though, that it doesn't really matter what we think about Nick Foles, Tom Brady, Donald Trump, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, your Maserati-driving neighbor. No offense to Maserati owners. Understanding the difference between genuine self-worth and ego-driven self-centeredness is found through one's own introspection, not through how others may perceive us. Finding that middle space between self-deprecation and excessive pride is more art than science and requires us to look deeply into our own hearts. Only you know if your heart is driven to share something prideful about yourself because of a genuine desire to serve others or because of a need to prop yourself up from a self-perceived position of inferiority. Only you can critically assess your motivations for making outward claims of success and achievement. I lurk on Facebook, but I rarely post. When I do, it's typically related to an achievement of one of my kids. Am I reacting to a genuine need, as we say in this space, to share a joy so great my heart can't contain it? Or am I seeking external adulation in the form of likes and comments, hoping that validation for the gifts and achievements of my kids will somehow validate me as one half of the duo that brought them into the world? I can tell you the answer isn't simple. Humility is tricky. I believe it's a bit of both, and I think that may be okay for that to be the case. I'm truly overjoyed when I see my kids squeezing every ounce of life and following their passions. I'm also keenly aware of the gravitational pull of Facebook notifications to see who liked, or better yet, who commented on how proud I must be and how wonderfully talented or successful my kids are. I battled with my decision to ask Sylvia, who's home on spring break, wherever she's sitting, right in front of me, if she would join us this morning because of the obvious perception of a lack of humility on my part. The truth is, even if the masses here this morning tagged me as a humble brag, I'd still accept that criticism for any chance I can get to see her perform. It's a very personal experience for me. One moment. That said, there are plenty of times and circumstances where I tend to exhibit a complete lack of humility. They're becoming more and more evident for me, especially after having to think deeply about it in preparation for this morning. But what has become very clear is that humility is a discipline that requires practice. Like self-worth and self-esteem, it can be fostered, I believe, with hard work, care, love, and determination. Practicing humility looks a lot like working on your self-love and your self-esteem because those are prerequisites to becoming humble. In the interest of lending a hand toward making progress on our collective journey toward cultivating humility, I'd like to share a couple of my favorite quotes on the topic. The first is from Ezra Taft Benson, who wrote, "Pride is concerned with who is right. Humility is concerned with what is right." I'm not sure I've heard a more poignant phrase that captures the state of our current political environment than that. The second quote is from Rick Warren, author of A Purpose-Driven Life. "Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less." What I take away from this is that being humble is an expression that flows from you, but that it's really about others. It isn't about you. It's really hard to imagine something that you do or say that's about yourself that's truly humble. In Nick Foles' case, he was asked a question about himself, but chose for his answer to be about others, thus remaining humble in the moment. If your boss congratulates you and says, "Great work on that incredibly challenging project," the response, "Oh, it was nothing," is not an expression of humility. In fact, it's the opposite. Downplaying your efforts as if to suggest that you have such a natural ability to do such things with ease comes from a place in your heart filled with uncertainty and self-doubt. Self-deprecation is not aligned with humility. The response, "Thank you, it was a very challenging project, and given how much I learned, it was certainly worth the extra effort," tends more toward what might be considered more humble. So let me finish up by offering 5 practical tips on how to foster a more humble existence. Some of these are from my own experience and head, and admittedly some of these are from like literally a how-to wiki I found online for being more humble. Okay? But they spoke to me. Number 1, seek to understand your place in this world from a cosmic scale. Famous UU philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell referred to Earth as, quote, "the petty planet on which our bodies impotently crawl." That's right. Fixating on the concept of our cosmic insignificance doesn't serve many purposes in life, but it can certainly be a helpful tool for allowing us to take our faults and insecurities in stride. Tom Brady may be the best quarterback ever to play football, but relative to the cosmos, he's just another thing that will impotently crawl on our petty planet for a remarkably short time. To gain this perspective, I'll once again turn my attention to mathematics, and specifically in this case, ratios. So there's a book by Natalie Angier. She's a science writer, but she's got wonderful prose. And she wrote a book called The Canon, a whirlwind tour of the beautiful basics of science. And she's got a chapter in there dedicated to the topic of calibration, where she illustrates our unnaturally warped sense of scale by retelling a William Blake anecdote as a way for us to grasp our relative place in the universe. It goes something like this. So you remember in middle school you had those mobiles or the little models that sat in the corner of our solar system with the sun and the planets, right? You remember those pictures? Well, if you thought that was close to scale, not even close, okay? So let's instead do a little exercise here to give you a sense of just how big our universe is, to give you a sense of just how small you are. I asked Ann to give me an orange this morning. I wasn't expecting a grapefruit. So precision isn't quite there with this. But let's assume that this orange is our glowing sun, okay? If that's the case, Earth would be a grain of sand right about where Dave Stow is, right about where Dave is. Jupiter, the biggest planet in our solar system, would be a pebble sitting underneath that other basket, okay? Neptune and Pluto, respectively, would be larger and smaller grains of sand about 2.25 blocks away, probably up near the Oxford Valley Golf Course. Okay? You following me so far? So the next closest star grouping to ours is the Alpha Centauri. if we went west from Penryn, where do you think that would be? There's a guess, Pittsburgh. A lot of people might say Langhorne, but that's okay. Actually, the truth is Jim's on the right track. Try Omaha, Nebraska. You know, if that doesn't make you feel pretty small, I'm not sure what does yet. So indulge me in one more metaphor. That was about size. Let's talk about our warped sense of time scale. Imagine if Mother Earth were sitting here today and she's turning 75. She just turned 75 literally this second. Her 75th birthday just happened. And she's sitting here in our congregation. Multicellular animals came into our existence when she was 63. Dinosaurs arrived when she turned 72, just 3 years ago. And humans showed up this morning. The wheel was invented within the last hour. The American Revolution was fought 2 minutes ago, and Neil Armstrong walked on the moon literally 20 seconds ago. When you see our sliver of human existence in this light, doesn't it seem silly to focus your conversations with fellow humans on how you can one-up them on a better story? From this perspective, I think it clearly makes more sense to think about how we can serve our fellow earthlings with love rather than compare our lives on social media. Number 2, be considerate in conversations. My brother likes to say that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so we can listen twice as much as we speak. One of the easiest ways to determine where you sit on the humility curve is to pay close attention to your reaction in conversations with others. Gauge whether or not you're actively listening to the person who is currently speaking, or if you're instead crafting your next input to the conversation. And take note if the nature of your input is supportive and complimentary of the points being made, or if it's really just a story or an anecdote or something to outshine the other's points. This form of one-upmanship is an expression of our lack of self-worth. Instead, catch yourself in that moment, redirect your attention back to the speaker, and lean into the point that they're trying to make. Dismiss your need to express a superior story, and instead consider a meaningful question for the speaker to learn even more about what she has to offer. Engaging in active, intentional listening is a form of acting in service to others. Listening affords opportunities for connecting with the conversation and its participants in a much deeper, more memorable way. Number 3, closely monitor your I am statements. If you recall Jim's sermon a couple weeks ago, that contrary to popular belief, narcissism and arrogance actually represents the absence of self-worth and self-love. Self-worth is essential for humility, so having tools to help you recognize where those self-degrading demons can exist can open the door to becoming more humble. One such tool is to catch yourself every time you start a sentence with the words, I am, and assess whether what comes next is helpful or hurtful to your personal growth. Oftentimes, what follows I am reflects comparison with others. Often, phrases like, I'm so ugly or I'm so stupid imply comparison with the looks or intelligence of others. As Anne always reminds me, comparison is the thief of joy. If you can catch yourself every time you start a sentence with the words, I am, you will shine a bright light on your fractured self-worth, allowing you to take steps to repair it and move toward a more humble experience. Number 4, recognize your own faults and admit your mistakes. This is where I get humble. Anne used to beat me mercilessly at games of fun when we were dating and just married, right? Things like mini golf, horse, bowling, and even the most successful game I've ever played, whack-a-mole. Incidentally, the secret there is you just use your peripheral vision. You don't stare at the moles. You just use your peripheral vision. That's a tip that will pay. You will win stuffed animals with that tip. But eventually she started beating me at whack-a-mole. I don't know how. In the early days, I would throw tantrums and truly act humiliated when I would lose to her. Back then, I truly felt less of, this is a long time ago, mind you, I truly felt less of myself by being beaten by a girl, let alone my girlfriend or my wife. I know, it's sad, right? Over the years, I've come to realize that humility prevents humiliation. Every time I've been humiliated, it's because that at some point prior to that event, I had tried to guide or manipulate others' perceptions of me into something more favorable or worthwhile. Humiliation comes when those perceptions don't pan out in reality. If you never set such perceptions, you can't be exposed to humiliation. In the case of my mini competitions with Anne, I wanted Anne to think I was good at all these games. I acted up after losing in hopes of sending the message to her that I'm really much better than I just showed. But after losing to her so many times, it was clear that she is just better at me than those things. Even the math nerd in me knows that the law of large numbers is going to bear the truth out in the long run. My call to action for us all is to recognize our own faults and admit our mistakes. As such, I'm duty-bound to admit that I do still throw tantrums from time to time, but I am getting better. Number 5, appreciate the talents and qualities of others and compliment them. My final mention of Jim this morning, I've been beating up Jim, is my way of practicing what I preach. Jim, I greatly appreciate the effort you've put forth to guide our worship services for the last gazillion years. You've given a great deal of yourself so we can all have a place to be enlightened on Sunday mornings. The persistence of longevity of your efforts is probably only rivaled by your wife Nancy, who tolls daily on our tactical finances. We're all indebted to you both, and we thank you for your service to us. In the spirit of this kind of concept of practice makes perfect, I'm going to enlist the services of Suzanne to come up with her other microphone and see if there's anybody else who wants to share one of, practice either number 4 or 5, which are sharing a humble moment through the lens of these practical pointers. So what I'd like is, if you've got something where you want to compliment somebody, where you think that they've really made a difference in your life, or if you want to share something that's been a mistake or a weakness of yours that you think might take it off your shoulders, I think now's the time to do that. Anybody care to jump in? Anybody dare to jump in? All right, I got a finger wave from Gil. It's not a full hand up. That's this. So Gil's going to placate me. Thank you, Gil. I swear I didn't arrange this with Gil beforehand.
Just a lesson in humility for me was I had been living out in Oregon for years, living in an ashram and meditating for an hour every morning and an hour every night. And meditation is basically focusing and concentrating, And so I went back to Michigan at one point to visit my family, and I ended up golfing with my brother. I step up to the first tee, and I'm thinking, I have all this practice with all this focus and concentration. This is going to be so great. And I completely missed the ball. So I was a little bit embarrassed, and yeah.
Excellent. He should have never set the perception that he was going to be any good at all. Anybody else want to share a story or provide a compliment or admit a weakness?
I just want to give a shout out to Mike Lee, who's a very humble person, who gives a lot of his time and never complains.
To Mike. Anybody else? Okay, great. Well, to sum it up, humility is definitely tricky. Being humble isn't a destination as much as it is a journey. I look forward to making this long walk with you.